There is a small brown bottle in half the bathrooms in this country, sold as a cosmetic ingredient, that was once considered so important a nation classified it as a war material. Most people who own it have no idea what it actually is, where it comes from, or what it was originally for. It sits on a shelf between the shampoo and the cotton buds. It costs about the same as a sandwich. The label says something about blemishes. 80 years ago, the men who harvested it were legally excused from fighting a world war, because the government decided their work mattered more. This is tea tree oil. And the reason nobody told you any of this is the same reason it disappeared in the first place. Start with the tree, because almost nothing about it matches what people assume. Melaleuca alternifolia is a paperbark, a scruffy, narrow-leaved tree with papery bark that peels away in sheets, growing to about 20 feet. It is not a tea plant. It has no relationship whatsoever to the tea in your cup, and it does not grow across Australia. Its natural range is astonishingly small, a restricted band of swampy, low-lying ground along the coast of northern New South Wales. Concentrated around a handful of river systems, a tree with a global reputation, native to a strip of wetland you could drive across in a morning. Everything the world now uses traces back to that ground. It likes waterlogged soil that would kill most trees. It regenerates ferociously after fire, and after cutting, chop the trunk down and it comes back from the base, which is the single fact that later made an entire industry possible. The leaves are the whole point. Narrow, fine, densely packed with oil glands. Crush a handful and the smell is immediate, sharp, medicinal, unmistakable. That scent is the plant defending itself, and it has been doing so for a very long time before anyone thought to bottle it. The Bundjalung people are the traditional owners of that country, and they knew exactly what the tree was. Crushed leaves went onto wounds and skin infections. Leaves were inhaled for congestion and used in poultices. There are accounts of healing lagoons where fallen paperbark leaves had steeped in the water for years, the lakes turning dark and oily, and people bathing in them. That knowledge was held for thousands of years in one region by people who lived beside the only place on Earth this tree grew wild. In 1770, James Cook's expedition reached the eastern coast. His crew, running short of supplies, brewed a drink from the aromatic leaves of a similar paperbark. They called it tea. The name stuck to the tree, and it has misled people ever since. The confusion is worse than a historical footnote. There are several unrelated plants in commerce carrying similar names. Cajeput and Nyali oils come from different Melaleuca species entirely. Manuka, from New Zealand, is sometimes called a tea tree and is a different genus with different chemistry. And the tea in a teacup, Camellia sinensis, has produced its own oil that shares nothing but a syllable. None of these are interchangeable. They differ in composition, in strength, and in how skin responds to them. Which is why the only name that means anything on a label is the botanical one. Melaleuca alternifolia and nothing else is tea tree oil in the sense the standard defines. Joseph Banks, the expedition's botanist, collected specimens, and there the Western Trail effectively goes cold for a century and a half, a curiosity in a herbarium, a name in a journal, and no idea at all what was in the leaves. The reason nothing happened for 150 years is simple. Nobody had the tools to ask the right question. Through most of the 19th century, European medicine had no framework for what the tree was doing. Infection was not understood as the work of organisms until germ theory took hold in the latter half of the century, and the chemistry required to separate a plant oil into its components and test each one arrived later still. Settlers in the region knew the tree. Local use is recorded. But knowing that crushed leaves helped a wound is not the same as knowing why. And without the why, there was nothing to build on, nothing to standardize, and nothing to sell to a hospital. The knowledge sat in that gap, real, observed, and unusable, until a laboratory existed that could measure it. That changed in 1925. Arthur Penfold was a chemist at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Sydney, working through Australian native plants and measuring what their oils could do. When he tested the oil distilled from Melaleuca alternifolia, the numbers did not look like the numbers from any of the others. The standard antiseptic of the era was carbolic acid phenol, the compound that had transformed surgery in the previous century and against which every disinfectant was measured. It was the benchmark. Penfold reported that tea tree oil was many times more powerful than carbolic acid as an antiseptic, roughly 11 to 13 times by the measure of the day. And it did something carbolic could not. Phenol burns tissue. Tea tree oil was strongly antiseptic. While being far gentler on skin, it could go onto a wound rather than merely onto a surface. By 1930, reports were appearing in the Medical Journal of Australia. Doctors and dentists began using it in wound cleaning, in oral work, on infected cuts and skin conditions. A local curiosity had become a serious clinical material within 5 years. Then came the industry, and it was unlike almost any other. The trees were not planted. They grew wild in the swamps, and men went in and cut them by hand. Bushcutters worked the wetlands with axes and machetes, felling the trees and hauling the leaf out to crude bush stills, drums fired with wood, steam driven through the leaves, the oil separated and collected on site. Everything happened where the trees stood, in mud and heat, because the leaf was too bulky and lost potency too fast to be carried far. It was miserable skilled work, and it produced a substance that hospitals wanted. The process itself is worth understanding because it explains the price and the fraud. The oil sits in glands inside the leaf, and the only practical way out is steam. Cut leaf goes into a sealed vessel. Steam is forced up through it. The heat ruptures the glands. The oil vaporizes and travels with the steam, and the mixture is cooled back to liquid, at which point the oil, being lighter and refusing to mix with water, floats and is drawn off the top. The yield is the part that surprises people. A ton of leaf produces roughly 10 to 20 kilograms of oil, somewhere around 1%. Everything else is water and spent leaf. That ratio is why the bottle is small, why the still had to sit beside the trees rather than the trees be carried to the still, and why adulteration has shadowed this industry since the beginning. Cheap synthetic terpenes can be blended in to bulk out a batch, and the resulting liquid smells convincing to anyone who has not tested it. The standard exists precisely because a bottle labeled tea tree oil could otherwise contain almost anything. By the outbreak of the Second World War, tea tree oil was not a folk remedy. It was a supply chain, and in wartime, the Australian government treated it accordingly. The oil was declared an essential commodity. It was issued into first aid kits, particularly for troops serving in the tropics, where cuts turned septic, fast and fungal infections disabled men as effectively as any wound. It went to munitions factories, added to machine-cutting oils to reduce the skin infections workers developed from metal splinters and abrasions. The tropical problem was not a minor one. In the jungle campaigns of the Pacific, disease and infection removed more men from the line than enemy fire did in some periods. Constant damp meant clothing never dried and skin never healed. Small cuts became tropical ulcers, open, spreading sores that ate into flesh and could take a man out of action for months. Fungal infections of the feet and groin were near universal and, in extreme cases, crippling. Against that, a bottle of something that could be poured onto a wound in the field that killed a broad range of organisms and that did not burn healthy tissue was not a luxury item. It was equipment, and the cutters, the men in the swamps with the axes, were exempted from military service. Consider what that decision means. A country at war, desperately short of manpower, calculated that a group of men were worth more standing in a wetland cutting leaves than carrying a rifle. Production was directed by government. Supply was controlled. For a few years in the 1940s, this oil was a strategic asset. Then the war ended, and within a decade it was gone. There was no ban, no scandal, no suppression. What happened was that medicine changed underneath it in the space of a few years, and nothing about tea tree oil could compete with what arrived. Penicillin moved into mass production. For the first time in history, a doctor could treat an infection that had already taken hold inside a body, systemically, decisively, with a course of tablets or injections. Alongside it came a wave of synthetic antiseptics and antifungals, standardized, stable, consistent batch to batch, and producible in a factory anywhere in the world. Tea tree oil could do none of that. It was topical, only useful on the surface of the skin, useless against an infection in the blood. Its composition varied with the tree, the season, and the still. And it depended entirely on wild trees in one small corner of Australia, cut by hand. Set that against a drug that could be manufactured industrially, shipped anywhere, and cured things that had killed people the year before. The bush stills went quiet. The cutters left. The market that had sustained an industry through a world war evaporated within a few years, and a plant that had been a national asset became a smell people vaguely remembered. Nothing was erased. It was simply outcompeted at exactly the moment medicine took its greatest leap forward, and once the industry collapsed, the knowledge went with it. It came back for an entirely unexpected reason. In the 1970s and 80s, interest in natural products revived, and this time, the approach was completely different. Instead of cutting wild trees, growers established plantations, planting Melaleuca alternifolia in dense rows and harvesting it mechanically, cutting the plants back hard and letting them regrow from the base again and again, exactly as they do after fire. That single change solved everything the old industry could not. Consistent supply, consistent quality, selected high-yielding stock rather than whatever happened to be standing in a swamp. The mechanics of a modern plantation are almost the opposite of the old bush industry. Trees are planted in dense rows and never allowed to become trees. They are cut low, close to the ground, on a cycle of roughly a year to 18 months. And they respond by throwing up thick, fresh growth from the base, which is precisely what is wanted. Because the young leaf is where the oil concentrates, harvesting is done by machine. The leaf goes to a fixed distillery on site rather than a drum in a swamp, and the timing of the cut is chosen against measured oil content rather than guesswork. A wild-cut industry dependent on finding good trees became an agricultural crop with a rotation, and the plant's own habit of regenerating hard after damage, the trait that let it survive fire in a wetland for millennia, turned out to be exactly the trait that made farming it possible. And because the oil could now be produced reliably, it could be standardized. An international standard, ISO 4730, defines what tea tree oil actually is, setting the required chemistry for a bottle to legally carry the name. That standard exists because of a specific problem, and the problem is the key to understanding the whole plant. Tea tree oil is not one chemical. It is a mixture of roughly 100 compounds, and 2 of them decide whether a bottle is any good. Terpenonferol is the active one. It is the compound responsible for the antimicrobial effect, and the standard requires a minimum concentration of it. 18-cineol is the problem. It is the eucalyptus smelling compound, and it is the main skin irritant in the oil. The standard sets a maximum, so the goal of the entire industry is oil that is high in terpenonferol and low in cineol. Maximum activity, minimum irritation. Plantation stock has been selected over decades for exactly that balance, which is why properly produced modern oil is both stronger and gentler than what came out of a drum in a swamp in 1943. The science, examined properly, is more interesting than either the hype or the dismissal. Terpenonferol works by attacking the cell membrane. Bacterial and fungal cells are held together by a membrane that controls what enters and leaves, and the compound disrupts that structure directly. The membrane leaks, ion balance fails, and the cell dies. That mechanism explains the breadth it works on bacteria, on fungi, on some viruses, because they all depend on a membrane. It is a physical assault on a structure, not a subtle biochemical lock and key. And it explains something else. Because the attack is structural rather than targeted at a single metabolic pathway. Developing resistance to it is a far harder problem for a microbe than developing resistance to a conventional antibiotic, which is precisely why researchers keep returning to it in an era of antibiotic resistance. The laboratory evidence is genuinely solid. Tea tree oil inhibits a wide range of organisms in vitro, including Staphylococci, and that includes strains resistant to conventional antibiotics. It has been studied in hospital settings for decolonizing skin. There is reasonable clinical evidence for topical use in acne and for fungal conditions of the skin, such as athlete's foot. The renewed research interest has a specific driver, and it is not fashion. Antibiotic resistance has forced a systematic re-examination of compounds that were shelved when the antibiotic era began. Bacteria that shrugged off drugs designed to jam a single enzyme are markedly less able to defend against something that simply dissolves the wall, holding them together. And a handful of old plant-derived antiseptics have been pulled back onto the bench for exactly that reason. Work on tea tree oil now looks at combination effects, whether it can restore the potency of existing drugs against resistant strains, and at applications where topical is enough on its own, such as reducing bacterial load on skin before surgery. None of that makes it a cure for anything. What it makes it is a compound that was set aside in 1945 for excellent reasons, and is being examined again because those reasons have started to expire. That is real, and it is why the oil is in your bathroom rather than in a museum. Now the boundary, stated plainly, because this is where the internet goes wrong. It works on surfaces. Skin, nails, hard surfaces. It does not treat an infection inside a body. It is not an antibiotic, and it does not replace one. A serious infection needs a doctor, and nothing about a plant oil changes that arithmetic. And there is one absolute rule that matters more than everything else in this video. Tea tree oil must never be swallowed. Ingesting it is genuinely toxic. It causes confusion, loss of coordination, drowsiness, and in serious cases, severe neurological effects and coma. Poisoning cases are reported regularly, and small children are the most vulnerable. Because a bottle of clear oil on a low shelf looks like nothing at all. It goes on skin. It never goes in a mouth. Beyond that, the practical uses are narrow and specific. It appears at low concentration in acne products, in antifungal preparations for feet and nails, in antiseptic creams, in shampoos aimed at scalp conditions, and in household cleaners where its antimicrobial activity is genuinely useful on hard surfaces. Concentrations matter enormously and varied by purpose. A formulated product is designed around a tested strength, which is one good reason to reach for a proper preparation rather than improvise with a dropper bottle. What it is not is a general-purpose remedy. It has no business being added to drinks, taken internally in any form, put in an ear canal, or used on broken skin over a large area. The rest of the safety picture is straightforward and worth knowing. Dilute it. Undiluted oil on skin causes irritation and dermatitis in a significant number of people. It is normally used at low concentrations in a carrier oil or a formulated product. And even spot application of neat oil is a reliable way to end up with red, angry skin. Patch test before using it properly on a small area and wait. Check the age of the bottle. Tea tree oil oxidizes on exposure to air, light, and heat, and oxidized oil is substantially more allergenic than fresh. The old bottle that has been open at the back of the cupboard for 4 years is the one most likely to cause a reaction. Store it sealed, dark and cool, and replace it, and keep it away from pets. This is the part almost nobody knows. Tea tree oil is highly toxic to cats and dogs. Cats especially, because their livers lack an enzyme system needed to process these compounds. Applying it to an animal's skin or letting them groom it off causes serious poisoning. And it happens every year to owners who thought they were treating fleas. None of this is medical advice. It is a description of a substance, its history, and its documented hazards. Which leaves the question the whole story turns on. What was actually lost? Not a miracle. The oil never cured anything systemic, and the men in the swamps were not sitting on a secret that would have changed medicine. What was lost was an entire domestic industry, and with it a body of practical knowledge. How to identify the best trees when the oil ran strongest, how to distill it in the field. That knowledge lived in the heads of bushcutters, and when the market died, most of it went with them, and a way of thinking was lost with it. For a brief period in the 20th century, a wealthy nation looked at a native tree growing in a swamp and asked, seriously and scientifically, what it could do, and then built an industry around the answer. That instinct faded almost completely once medicine could be manufactured, and it is only now returning under pressure. As antibiotic resistance forces researchers back through the plants that were set aside in 1945, the tree was never hidden. It was simply overtaken in the space of about 5 years by something that could do more. There is one detail that captures the whole arc. That standard, ISO 4730, the international specification defining what tea tree oil must contain, exists because the oil became a global commodity. Australia grows the bulk of it, on plantations descended from stock selected out of those original wild swamps, and it is shipped worldwide as an ingredient in soaps, shampoos, acne treatments, and cleaning products. The tree came out of a wetland in northern New South Wales, was carried into 2 world wars, was abandoned for penicillin, and returned as a line on an ingredients list. The bottle in the bathroom is the last surviving piece of that supply chain, It contains the same compound Arthur Penfold measured against carbolic acid in a Sydney laboratory in 1925. It comes from the same species, the bundjalung crushed onto wounds for thousands of years before that, and almost every person who owns one bought it for a spot on their chin. Knowledge does not usually disappear because someone destroys it. It disappears because something more convenient arrives and industry collapses, and the people who held the working details in their hands move on to other work. And within one generation, nobody is left who can say why the thing mattered. Then the object survives, stripped of its history, sitting on a shelf, sold for a fraction of what it once was. If this vault opens something for you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every like and share helps carry this knowledge forward. Tell us in the comments whether there is a bottle of this in your bathroom right now, and whether you had any idea what it actually was. The next vault opens soon.